1,500 Welsh longbowmen standing shoulder to shoulder in a line stretching across an open Scottish field. Each one of them trained since boyhood to draw a bow so powerful it would permanently warp the bones in their shoulders and arms. Each one capable of releasing 10 to 12 arrows every single minute. Do the math. That is somewhere between 15 and 18,000 arrows launched into the sky every 60 seconds. Each arrow traveling at roughly 200 feet per second. Each one capable of punching clean through chain mail at 100 yards. Now imagine you are standing on the other side of that field. You are a Scottish infantryman. You are packed so tightly against your comrades that you cannot move your arms freely. You are holding a 12-foot spear pointed outward because that is what you were told to do. You were told this formation would protect you. You were told the spears would stop the cavalry. And they did. The cavalry is gone. But now you hear something. A sound no one prepared you for. A low whistling hum rising from behind the English lines. Growing louder. Climbing higher. And then the sky above you goes dark. Not from clouds. From arrows. Thousands of them. Hanging at the top of their arc for one sickening heartbeat before tilting downward and falling straight into you and every man around you like iron rain. You cannot dodge. You cannot run. You cannot even kneel without being impaled on the spear of the man behind you. All you can do is stand there and die. That is not a dramatization. That is what happened on July the 22nd, 1298. At the Battle of Falkirk, and the moment those arrows began to fall, something changed in the history of warfare that would never be undone. A formula was born that day, a formula so devastating, so brutally efficient, that it would be repeated again and again across the next century and a half, annihilating armies 3 times the size of the force that wielded it. Historians would later call it the combined arms approach. But the men who lived through it and the men who died under it had a simpler name for what those arrows did. They called it slaughter. To understand how Falkirk happened, you have to understand the man who chose to fight there and the man who came to destroy him. William Wallace was riding a wave of fame that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. In September of 1297, Wallace had pulled off one of the most stunning upsets in medieval military history at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. There, he had lured a massive English force across a narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth, and then attacked when only half the army had crossed. The English were caught in a bottleneck with nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to retreat, and nowhere to survive. It was a massacre. Wallace became a legend overnight. Scotland rallied behind him. He was named Guardian of Scotland. Peasants and nobles alike looked at him and saw a liberator, the man who had proven that the mighty English war machine could bleed. But Wallace was no fool. He knew exactly why Stirling Bridge had worked. It worked because of geography. The narrow bridge had neutralized England's greatest advantage, its heavy armored cavalry. Those knights, mounted on war horses draped in chain and plate, were the medieval equivalent of tanks. On open ground, they would roll over infantry formations like a wave crashing through sand. Wallace understood this. He understood that Stirling Bridge was a tactical miracle made possible by terrain. And he knew that if he ever faced the English on open ground without a choke point to exploit, the calculus would change entirely. And yet, that is exactly what happened at Falkirk. On the other side of the equation stood Edward I of England, known to history as Longshanks, one of the most ruthless and militarily brilliant monarchs ever to sit on the English throne. Edward was not a man who absorbed a humiliation like Stirling Bridge and moved on. He was a man who internalized it, dissected it, and came back with something worse. By the summer of 1298, Edward had assembled the largest English army mustered in decades. The numbers are staggering. Roughly 25,000 men in total. Among them, approximately 2,500 armored heavy cavalry, the elite striking force of any medieval army, and crucially, 1,500 Welsh longbowmen. These archers were not English. They were Welshmen, drawn from the valleys and hills of Wales, men whose ancestors had used the longbow against the English themselves before being conquered and absorbed into Edward's military machine. Now they marched north under the English banner, and they carried with them a weapon that was about to redefine what was possible on a battlefield. Wallace knew Edward was coming. He knew the size of the army bearing down on him, and he made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He chose to fight at Falkirk, on relatively open ground, with no river crossing, no narrow bridge, no natural choke point to funnel the English into a cool zone. Instead, Wallace staked everything on a defensive formation called the schiltron. He arranged roughly 6,000 Scottish infantry into 4 massive circular formations. Picture enormous human hedgehogs. Men packed shoulder to shoulder in tight concentric rings, each one holding a 12-foot-long spear pointing outward in every direction. The theory was sound. No cavalry horse on earth would willingly charge into a wall of razor-sharp spear points. The schiltrons were designed to be immovable objects, anchors on the battlefield that would break any cavalry charge thrown against them. Between these schiltron circles, Wallace positioned his own archers, a modest force of Scottish bowmen, and a small contingent of Scottish cavalry to screen and harass. On paper it looked defensible. In practice, it contained a fatal blind spot so enormous that it would cost 10,000 men their lives. Wallace had built his entire plan around stopping cavalry. He did not know, could not have known, that Edward had already decided not to rely on cavalry alone. Edward had something else in mind. Before we get to the battle itself, you need to understand the weapon that made everything that followed possible, because the English longbow was not just another ranged weapon. It was an engineering marvel disguised as a stick and a string. The longbow stood nearly 6 feet tall, carved from a single stave of yew wood, and it required a draw weight of up to 180 pounds. To put that in perspective, drawing that bow was roughly equivalent to doing a one-armed pull-up, and an archer in battle was expected to do it 10 to 12 times every minute for sustained periods. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were athletes forged from childhood, their skeletons literally deformed by years of training, their left arms often visibly thicker than their right from decades of pulling against that immense resistance. But here is the thing about the longbow that most people misunderstand, and it is the key to understanding Falkirk. The longbow was not terrifying because it was accurate. It was terrifying precisely because it did not need to be. On a medieval battlefield, individual targeting was almost meaningless. The chaos, the dust, the movement, the noise, none of it allowed for the kind of precision shooting you might imagine. That was not the point. The longbow was a volley weapon. Archers did not pick out a single enemy soldier and shoot at him. They fired together, in coordinated waves, launching hundreds or thousands of arrows simultaneously in a high arcing trajectory. The arrows would climb steeply into the air, slow at the top of their arc, and then tip over and fall almost vertically downward into a designated kill zone on the ground. This is critical. They were not shooting at men. They were shooting at areas. Entire sections of the battlefield would simply become death traps, zones where arrows fell from the sky like vertical hail. And because the arrows were descending almost straight down, They bypassed the one thing infantry relied on for protection, their shields. Shields were held overhead or in front, but they could not cover everything. The arrows found the gaps. They struck necks. They struck shoulders. They hit faces, arms, the tops of feet, the spaces between helmet and collar. Anywhere armor did not perfectly seal, the arrows found flesh. And at Falkirk, there were 1,500 bows delivering this nightmare simultaneously. Up to 18,000 arrows per minute falling from the sky into packed formations of men who could not move. Now let us walk through the battle itself, because it unfolded in phases, and each phase was worse than the last for the Scots. Phase 1 went exactly the way Wallace had planned. The English heavy cavalry, those 2,500 armored knights, lowered their lances and thundered across the field toward the schiltrons. It must have been a terrifying sight, the ground shaking, the sound of hoofs like rolling thunder. But the schiltrons held. The horses hit the wall of spears and recoiled. Animals screamed. Knights were thrown. The formation did not break. The cavalry pulled back, regrouped, charged again. Same result. The spears were too dense, too long, too lethal. No horse would push through them. Wallace's defensive design was working perfectly. For a few brief minutes, it must have seemed like Stirling Bridge all over again. Then Edward changed the game, and everything fell apart. Edward did something that no commander on a European battlefield had done at this scale before. He pulled his cavalry back entirely and ordered his 1,500 longbowmen forward. This was the moment the battle pivoted, and it pivoted on a catastrophe that Wallace could not have anticipated. Wallace had placed his own Scottish archers between the schiltron circles specifically to counter English bowmen. If Edward advanced his archers, Wallace's archers were supposed to engage them, suppress their fire, and buy the schiltrons time. But before that could happen, the small force of Scottish cavalry, the mounted troops Wallace had positioned to screen and support, broke. They panicked. Whether it was the sight of the English army reforming, the scale of what they were facing, or simple loss of nerve, the Scottish cavalry turned and fled the field entirely. This was the hinge moment. With the cavalry gone, the Scottish archers were left completely exposed, standing in the open between the schiltron circles with no protection and no mounted support. The English longbowmen outnumbered them by a factor of at least 15 to 1. The Scottish archers were cut down in minutes, and just like that, Wallace's layered defense collapsed into a single element. The schiltrons were alone. 4 massive circles of men packed tightly together, standing motionless on open ground. They were the most perfect archery targets in the history of medieval warfare. Edward gave the order. 1,500 longbows drew back as one. The first volley rose into the July sky. Flight time, approximately 3 seconds, and then impact. Chroniclers who were present described the sound of the arrows striking the schiltrons as resembling hail hitting a tile roof, a continuous clattering roar of iron points striking wood, leather, metal, and flesh. The volleys did not stop. They continued, wave after wave after wave, minute after minute. The arrows kept coming, and inside the schiltrons, the horror was unlike anything those men had ever experienced. The very formation that had saved them from the cavalry now became their prison. They could not break ranks because the moment the circular formation lost its integrity, the spear wall collapsed, and they would be defenseless against a renewed cavalry charge. They could not charge forward toward the archers because the distance was too great, and they would be cut down long before they covered the ground. and they could not retreat because the men packed behind them were pressing forward, and the spears of their own comrades pointed inward as much as outward in the crush. They were trapped. All they could do was stand there, raise whatever shield they had, and endure. But the arrows found them anyway, through gaps in shields, through leather armor that was never designed to stop a bodkin point falling from height, into faces, into throats, into the narrow, vulnerable channels between helmet and shoulder. The ground around and inside the schiltrons became so thick with embedded arrow shafts that one chronicler described it as looking like a field of steel wheat. Thousands of Scottish soldiers died without ever raising a weapon against the enemy. They died standing up, packed so tightly that some of the dead could not even fall, held upright by the press of bodies around them. The volleys went on for what must have felt like an eternity. And when the arrows finally began to thin, it was not because Edward showed mercy. It was because the schiltrons had been so badly shredded that gaps had opened in the formations. Men were dead or dying in heaps. The discipline that held the circles together was shattered. Morale was gone. And that is when Edward sent the cavalry back in. This time, there were no intact spear walls to stop them. The knights crashed into broken, bleeding, demoralized clusters of men who had been standing under arrow fire for the better part of an hour. It was not a battle anymore. It was an execution. By the time the field was quiet, an estimated 10,000 Scottish soldiers lay dead. Wallace himself escaped, fleeing into the Scottish countryside. But his reputation, his aura of invincibility, the legend of the man who had beaten England at Stirling Bridge, all of it died on that field, even if he did not. Scotland's rebellion was effectively crushed, and Wallace would spend the next several years as a hunted fugitive before being captured in 1305, dragged to London, and executed as a traitor in one of the most gruesome public deaths of the medieval period. But the true legacy of Falkirk was not what it did to Scotland. It was what it taught England. Edward's commanders walked away from that battlefield with a revelation that would reshape European warfare for the next 150 years. For centuries, heavy cavalry had been the dominant force on every battlefield in Europe. Armored knights were considered virtually unstoppable. Entire military doctrines, entire feudal social structures, were built around the supremacy of the mounted warrior. Falkirk proved that massed archery could neutralize the strongest infantry formations ever devised, and in doing so, create the openings that cavalry needed to deliver the killing blow. This was the Falkirk Formula. Archers disrupt, damage, and break. Cavalry exploits and destroys. It was the birth of the combined arms approach, and once Edward's successors understood it, they used it to devastating effect again and again and again. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, an English army of roughly 12,000 faced a French force nearly 3 times its size. The English deployed their longbowmen in the same massed volley formation pioneered at Falkirk. The result was identical. French cavalry charges were shredded by arrow storms before they ever reached the English lines. The French lost over 10,000 men. The English lost fewer than 300. 10 years later at Poitiers, the formula repeated, and then again in 1415 at Agincourt, perhaps the most famous English battlefield victory of all time, where Henry V's outnumbered, starving, disease-ridden army annihilated a French force that outnumbered them by as many as 5 to 1. The weapon that made it possible every single time was the longbow. The tactic that made it lethal every single time was the massed volley. And the formula that tied it all together: archers break them, cavalry finishes them, was born on a field near Falkirk on a July afternoon in 1298. The French came to fear the longbow more than any other weapon in the English arsenal. They called it the devil's weapon. Captured English archers were routinely mutilated, their drawing fingers sliced off so they could never shoot again. That is how terrified an entire nation became of a piece of yew wood and a hemp string. And the lesson that Falkirk taught, the lesson that echoed down through Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt and beyond, is one of the most enduring truths in military history. Technology can overcome tactics. Range can defeat strength. And the most devastating weapon on any battlefield is the one that kills you before you ever get close enough to fight back. Edward I walked away from Falkirk with a blueprint for English military dominance that would last for over a century. William Wallace walked away with a shattered army, a broken reputation, and a target on his back that would follow him for the rest of his short life. But here is the question that haunted Scottish commanders for years afterward and still lingers in the minds of historians today. What if Wallace had positioned his archers differently? What if he had placed them behind the schiltrons instead of between them, protected rather than exposed? What if the Scottish cavalry had held their ground instead of fleeing? What if the schiltrons had been mobile rather than static, advancing under cover rather than standing still as targets? Would the outcome have changed? Would the Falkirk Formula have ever been born? We will never know. What we do know is that 1,500 men with longbows did what 2,500 armored knights on war horses could not. They broke an army. They broke a rebellion. And they changed the way wars were fought for the next 200 years. The arrows that fell on Falkirk that day did not just kill 10,000 men. They killed an entire era of warfare and gave birth to a new one.